Our best friends have a variety of names: Bailey, Sally, Shay. Without their names, they would just be four legged canines. Once we name an animal, we humanize it. We begin to see its behavior in relation to our own. We ascribe its interactions with the world as an outcome of its environment. Without a name, it is just an animal which acts in accordance with its genetic makeup. What is behavior and how does it evolve? What can animal behavior teach us about how we behave? Welcome to Brungart Law's Lanyap, wherein we provide you a little extra perspective through conversations with individuals from all walks of life. I'm Maurice Brungart, your host. I enjoy engaging with experienced, knowledgeable, and passionate individuals for the opportunity it affords to broaden and deepen understanding of the world through their eyes. They have a story to tell, and we may discover a thing or two. The more we learn, the more likely we can become better versions of ourselves, guide others towards the same, and perhaps have a little fun along the way. Today's guest is Dr. Marlene Zuk. She's an evolutionary biologist and behavioral ecologist at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Zuk is the author of Paleofantasy, Sex on Six Legs, as well as Dancing Cockatoos and the Dead Man Test. Welcome to the program, Dr. Zuk.
Thanks for having me.
So, why don't you explain to us what exactly is an evolutionary biologist and behavioral ecologist?
I will say that in response to the thing of what's an evolutionary biologist, a long time ago I was being interviewed by a radio station in Texas about a book that I had written, and the interviewer sounded absolutely incredulous that he was clearly reading from a script, and he said, "And you do evolutionary biology, what is that?" And I felt really dumb, but I just ended up saying it was a biologist who studied evolution, which was clearly something he had not really thought a lot about, or maybe even heard of. But anyway, so the evolutionary biologist part, I hope, is fairly self-explanatory in that I'm a biologist interested in the process of evolution, and the behavioral ecologist is a way of saying that I study animal behavior from an evolutionary perspective and of animals in their natural environment. So as opposed to being somebody who's a psychologist who studies animals but is interested, say, in learning in white rats or something like that. So I'm interested in animal behavior as it relates to the environment of the animal, and I take an evolutionary perspective.
And
hopefully you've heard of evolutionary biology.
I have. And what got you into this field of study?
I've always been interested in animals. It took me a long time to realize that being interested in animals and being a biologist had anything to do with each other, because I don't come from an academic background at all. And when I started learning about stuff in school, I assumed that if I was going to be a biology major in college, that therefore I would have to be a doctor, which, at one point I spent about 10 minutes as a biology major thinking that I was going to be a doctor, and then realized very quickly that that wasn't what I was interested in, and then was delighted to discover that as a biologist you could actually study animals, and that was a thing you could make a living off of. And so, I got into it that way. There were a lot of detours along the way, but that's the basic story.
And when you were making this discovery, did this happen because you were discovering things such as research? I ask because my own daughter, she started off in the field of neurobiology with the idea of becoming a neurosurgeon. And then she started working in a primate lab and was doing research, and she just fell in love with that field. And now she's pursuing a much different field of study. Was something similar to your situation?
Not really, because I think I decided I was interested in studying animals before I knew that there was such a thing as research, although I did have great, amazing opportunities to do research when I was an undergraduate. This is actually a very timely thing to be talking about, because I was just in a symposium commemorating Jane Goodall, who of course died very recently, and who I think was really an inspiration to a lot of young people, like me, especially girls, who looked at what Jane Goodall did, which was to, go off to Africa and watch chimpanzees and study their behavior and think about animals, and to do that for a profession. And it was just a revelation to think that someone could do that, because I'd had absolutely no idea. And again, it was particularly compelling, I think, that she was a young woman. I was a child at the time, but it was just really incredible. And so a lot of it came from being exposed to, things like that. I wonder how many thousands and thousands of girls Goodall inspired in her lifetime of work.
Well, I know she inspired my daughter because she, for in one school project, dressed up as Jane Goodall.
Is that right? Oh, that's
Yes.
wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah, so Jane Goodall obviously has a, very influential legacy. And in your particular case, where did you end up going to school?
I grew up in Los Angeles, and I was an undergraduate at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and now realize, and I didn't realize it at the time, that that was a very fortunate choice because the biology program there was extremely uh, organismally oriented. So it wasn't largely a program in cell and molecular biology, which many of them are, but there were many, many opportunities to get outside. There were many opportunities to learn about animals. And on top of that, I was also fortunate in that I was part of what's called the College of Creative Studies, which is, I always tell people, only partially joking, that the College of Creative Studies is kind of like an honors college within the university, only instead of being for smart people, it's for weird people. And I think that, that's really, I think the pithiest description, in that it did emphasize research. It emphasized people who were very, very passionate about what they were interested in. There were, at the time, I think 7 or 8 majors: physics, math, biology, studio art. So you could be an artist, but you had to be it was not art history. It was studio art. Let's see what else. A handful of other English, and creative writing. And I learned a lot about creative writing from that, and became interested in creative writing, which obviously has stayed with me as well. So between the College of Creative Studies and being able to be in beautiful Santa Barbara, I think that really helped a lot in terms of my future career goals too.
Now, from what I remember in your book, Sex on Six Legs, you made a specific reference to growing up in Los Angeles and discovering and admiring and following insects. Is this what initially turned you on to become a, say, peeping Tom of the animal kingdom?
Um, Sure. Although the emphasis on insects and being in Los Angeles, part of the point about that is that animals are everywhere, and you don't have to, live in the wilderness and the back of beyond in order to see fabulous and amazing animal behavior. And insects are such a great way to introduce people, it's maybe especially kids, to the natural world. And that was certainly my introduction because, I didn't have, anything very exciting in the way of, great big megafauna in my backyard, but everybody's got insects, and I did too. So that was a big that was a big part of why I got interested. And I did stay interested in insects, although I've worked on other things, and I don't really consider myself a professional entomologist, largely because that requires a lot of more specialized training than I've had. And also a lot, though not all, of entomologists seem to mostly want to control insects, which is a laudable goal. It's just not I don't really want to spend all my time killing them. So.
Well, speaking of backyards, I can relate in a certain matter of speaking. As a kid, I would love, pursuing little green lizards and trapping them, putting them in jars, in addition to wasps that would form their nest outside my window. But
where was that?
that was in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would occasionally trap them, and then I would, experiment putting like little pieces of candy or honey or sugar just to see, what they seem to prefer. They always seem drawn to candy canes. So, but that's.
I don't really think lizards. I hate to tell you this. I don't really think lizards eat candy canes. But,
No, those were the wasps. The lizards were
oh.
eating the cockroaches and berries. So, anyway, so how is the study of animal behavior funded?
It depends what kind of animal behavior you're doing, obviously. So I'm a professor, which means that I get paid by the university to do teaching and research, and my research program has largely been funded from either small sort of local sources or from the National Science Foundation, which funds what's called basic research. So the funding sources generally distinguish between what I do, which is basic research, or sometimes called discovery research, sometimes called blue sky research, although that is usually more in a techie sense. and more applied research where you might be doing work in agriculture or medicine. And I'm a big proponent of doing basic research, of trying to ask questions that just say, how does the world work? And it's something that I've really emphasized with students for a long, long time, that they shouldn't feel kind of sheepish about, oh, I'm spending my time, if they're working in my lab, watching crickets mate or something like that, because we're always answering bigger questions. We're asking big questions about the world, and no, it's not going to result in a cure for cancer or a reduction in pollution the next day. But understanding how the world works is absolutely critical to being able to address those more applied questions. And I used to give a talk where I read a sentence about the crystalline structure of a particular acid molecule. And the last sentence of it said something about how this structure might have interesting implications for other things. But it sounds incredibly broad and basic and everything else. And it's the last sentence of Watson and Crick's paper about the structure of DNA. And so their study was not designed so that you could do, I don't know, a paternity test of a kid and show up on a talk show, but that's what it ends up being. And so I think I'm a really passionate proponent of basic research, because you don't know where it's going to go, you don't know how useful it's going to be, but you need to figure out how the world works before you can do anything else. Sorry, that was a bit of a soapbox, but I appreciate the opportunity.
No, it makes perfect sense because, again, I think we can get hyper-focused sometimes on, in this case, someone is doing a particular type of research, and obviously it's going to be very granular. And for others, it may seem like, well, how does that impact me, or why should we fund this, whether taxpayer funding or through an endowment or whatnot. And what you're talking about is basically the ripple effects, right?
Absolutely. And that there can't be any ripple effects unless you throw that stone into the pond to begin with. And I think a lot of people just want to focus on the ripples, and they don't understand that it takes, if you really want to be bizarre about the analogy, it takes a lot of heavy lifting to get that stone in there. And when you get that stone in there, you just don't know where the ripples are going to go. And so I get really frustrated by people who always want an immediate payoff from the kind of investment we're making in basic science. Having said that, I think the question of what good is this is a very, very good question. And I also don't think scientists should ignore that the public or funding agencies or anybody else want to know, like, well, what are you going to do with this information? Why does this matter? And I think, it is important to understand why it's potentially going to matter. But that answer is often going to be a 30,000 feet answer about, well, like in my case, it matters how we understand the evolution of male and female differences, because we're going to be able to use that to understand males and females in lots and lots of different species, even though I'm studying crickets.
Well, you pretty much preempted my following question. That was about how research benefits society. So I'll kind of slightly shift. And from your experience, how much of the funding would you say stems, say, from the government level, where it's federal funding or state level funding? How much of a proportion does that consist of?
Proportion of what? Because so the National Science Foundation's budget is a minuscule fraction of the overall federal budget. It's far smaller, for instance, than the National Institutes of Health, which funds medical research. And arguably, obviously I'm biased, it seems to me that doing that basic research is, if anything, more important, because you have to have that bedrock before you can go off and apply it. And if you don't understand, for instance, the mechanism behind, you don't want people just testing substances willy-nilly on something. Let's say you want to try and cure a disease. You need to understand the biology behind the disease and how it happens. I used to teach a class talking about alternative medicine and how people develop various ways of curing diseases. And the students were always initially were very I don't know, dismissive of the idea that you had to understand the mechanism behind how something worked, because they said, well, but if, it's an herbal remedy and people have been using it for a long time and it seems to work, then why do we care, how it works? And I said, but you have to care, because if you don't understand how your physiology reacts to it, then you won't be able to say, make the cure better. You won't be able to understand why it works in some people and not others. You won't be able to understand whether there might be a different substance that works in a different way, but also is especially useful in curing that disease. And so understanding the mechanism requires understanding basic biology about, the human body, or about the way cells function or tissues function or something like that. And I think that basic biology is tied up in almost every application that you can think of. Somebody had to do the groundwork, or else you couldn't have even gotten started on it. And that's true for agriculture, and it's true for health, and it's true for, if you want to look at the effect of, toxins on the environment or something, you have to understand the mode of operation, or you're never going to get anywhere. You're just going to be blindly following instructions. And scientists don't like blindly following instructions. We want to know why we're doing something.
Specific to the work that you've done over the years, the books that you've published, and tied into sort of this question, the impacts on society. Anecdotally, have you heard directly from members of other professions who have said, hey, I read your book and, it influenced the way we did things in my organization or the way I conduct my own work? And not necessarily among the scientific community. I mean, say the legal community or the art, whatnot.
Sure. I'll give a couple of examples, one from science, and one from sort of more, broader. From the scientific community, a lot of my early work was centered on the effect of parasites on their hosts' ecology and evolution and behavior. And I think that work helped to fuel a kind of renaissance of interest in parasites as being really important in life in general, rather than just being weird, icky, kind of a weird, icky subfield of what people were studying. That parasites are important, that I think a lot of people picked up, not just on my work, but on, lots of stuff that was connected with it. The idea that parasites are important in basic aspects of evolution. And I actually, my second book was about that. It's called Riddled with Life. Let's see if I can remember the subtitle: Friendly Worms, Ladybugs, Sex, and the Parasites That Make Us Who We Are. And so the argument is that parasites have been responsible for a lot of things that we don't think about in life, like the evolution of sexual reproduction. So I think that in that sense, it's had some effects, but that's not just me all by myself, by a long shot. That's been part of, the way science has changed, but I'm happy to have, played a part in it. From a more sort of a different slant, I think an interest of mine for a long time has been in same-sex sexual behavior in animals, so which we talk about, and I use that phrase because we don't like to talk about homosexual behavior or gay animals or whatever, in part because it ends up being too hard to, we don't want to attribute things to animals that we know from humans, and we don't know necessarily that they happen in animals. Anyway, I and a former postdoc of mine wrote a paper on the evolution of same-sex behavior in animals, and that ended up getting picked up on by a legal team that was looking at same-sex marriage in, obviously, people. And so that was an interesting repercussion of this, because they were interested in the degree to which you could talk about that behavior being widespread or something you would see in other species, and that kind of thing. So, which was not certainly something we were anticipating when we wrote it.
Well, we may come back to that particular topic. Out of curiosity, have you ever been asked to testify in a court proceeding?
I have not. I have colleagues who have, but no, I have not.
Okay. Tell us briefly about your book, Sex on Six Legs. I mean, everybody likes to talk about sex, and I think it might be particularly of interest to the audience to discover how male honeybees' genitals explode after mating.
That is always a
Yes.
popular one when I teach. That is always a popular one when I teach. So like I said, I started out looking at insects because they were there and it was an easy thing to do. But I really do think insects provide such a great lens into understanding life itself, in part because insects are so incredibly diverse. People often, I mean, we're humans and we think about humans and we think about humans as being more interesting than any other organism, and I understand why we do that. But almost anything you can think of that you think is weird in humans is commonplace in insects. And so I wanted to write the book to introduce people not just to how cool insects were, but to how they illustrate a lot of things about evolution and about life in general that people would have said, oh no, that's not natural, that's not something animals can do. And so, all right, so you really do want to hear about the honeybees? We can do the honeybees in particular if you.
Not necessarily. It's just simply a generic example of the whole. And
I know I'm always happy to talk about honeybees.
And when it comes to sex, I mean, from your observations of the animal kingdom and extrapolating and looking at humans, are we driven by choice, instinct? Is it both? I mean, I've heard people make, and I don't know if this is actually true, but humans are the only animals that engage in sex outside of a particular mating season. I don't know how true that is. I'm just more curious, based on your observations, what drives us towards that?
All right, well, let's take those things one at a time. So first of all, the idea that humans are the only animals that have sex outside a mating system is not true.
Okay.
There's lots of animals that have sex outside the mating system. And one of the things that has impressed me for a long time is how people don't really get that sex is about, I think people have this impression that sex in animals is kind of like, I don't know, like a 1950s sitcom where everybody's part of like the old-fashioned Catholic Church or something, where procreation is solely for reproduction, and where males are always dominant and females are always submissive, and it's sort of everything's in a nuclear family and so on and so forth. And honestly, nothing could be, further from the truth, in that, for instance, lots and lots of animals ranging from, insects to birds to lots of primates even, or several primates even, will have sex outside of the so-called mating season or the time of reproductive receptivity for females. In insects, it's particularly common because females in most insects can store sperm for long periods of time, sometimes up to years, depending on what kind of insect you're talking about. And so the separation of mating and fertilization of the egg means that, so it's, having sex doesn't really need to be associated with a particular time of year or a particular season. And the other thing is that in at least some animals, sex is about, just like it is in humans, sex is about more than just, making babies, that it has to do with, animals being pair bonded. It has to do with animals, like I said, exhibiting some other, kind of behavior, or being in bonobos, which is everybody's favorite example of this, which are relatives of chimpanzees. They'll engage in sexual behavior sometimes when there's tension or kind of conflict in the group. I remember talking to a student about this at one point and trying to explain it to him, and I said, so, like it would mean that in bonobos, if, there's two individuals that are, fighting over a banana, that, if it was chimpanzees, maybe one of them would hit the other one. But if it was bonobos, then, they'd end up having sex. And the reason I remember this is because the student then wanted to know, but who would get the banana? And I had to point out that at that point, no one really cared who got the banana. Okay, I respect your question.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, we kind of forgot what the ultimate object here was. In the non-human world, Have you or your peers documented evidence or anything akin thereto regarding consent among animals?
Sure. Um, if and again, you want to use this cautiously
Yes.
because I'm always very nervous about people who want to look at animals like they're little humans and or big
Yes.
humans or whatever, and attribute the exact same emotions or the exact same motivations to them. At the same time, um, for example, in in the crickets that I study, so the way sex works in crickets, which a lot of people surprisingly have not actually spent a lot of time thinking about, males chirp to produce, they produce this song that you hear outside at night in the summer, that you say, oh, there's a cricket. And those are only the males that do that. The females approach the males because they can hear the song. And then the males switch to a different kind of song. It's structurally different. The two antenate each other, which means they touch their antennae and they ascertain that, are you a male or are you female? Okay, we could theoretically go ahead and mate. And then a female can just walk away. But if she consents, if you want to use that word, then what she does is climb on top of the male, and she has to orient her body in exactly the appropriate way. And the male will kind of pass her a little package of sperm. So they don't have an organ or any sort of equivalent of a penis. They just extrude this little packet of sperm, and the sperm has the sperm package has like a little handle on it, and the little handle gets threaded inside the reproductive opening of the female, and then the sperm drains through that. And the female has to cooperate through all of that, or none of it's going to happen. Do you want to call that consent? I guess. So none of it can happen unless the female cooperates. There are other animals where males will just sort of jump on females and mate with them. In those cases, sometimes what will happen afterwards is that if the female wasn't interested in that male, she'll end up ejecting his sperm, or she won't use it to fertilize her eggs. So there's lots and lots of really complicated stuff that can go on here that I think, I have a good friend who is a poet in the English department, and we talk a lot about writing and about science, and how to communicate it and stuff. And she always says that, well, what she's learned from me is that every time we end up talking, I always end up saying, well, it's really complicated. And so now she's learned to say, oh, I bet it's complicated. It sounds kind of facile, but honestly, yes, it's really complicated. A lot of times it's complicated. All animals are not alike. All insects are not alike. Things happen differently under different circumstances. And I sometimes feel like a lot of what I try to do in my books and when I give talks is to give people just a little taste of how complicated it is, and that it being complicated that's not a bug, that's a feature.
Well, I always like to say the devil's in the details.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think even on the simplest of topics, when you talk to people, just the conversation starts leading to more information, and one starts to realize things are not as simple as they appear to be. And I think an interesting aspect of you pushing back on being very careful how we use the word consent and looking at the animal kingdom. I mean, there's a certain application of this to just between people. If I, from one culture, a Western culture, to oversimplify things, I'm trying to assess the way people are acting or operating, behaving in an Eastern culture. Just again, an oversimplification. Again, I'm ascribing some of my tendencies, the way we do things, to them, and perhaps unfairly. Obviously, there's going to be greater similarities among humans, but flipping things on its head and deviating just for a moment, us being very careful about how we're looking at the animal kingdom and using words like consent when we're sort of imposing typical human behaviors on animals. Have you ever found, observing animals, that they are looking at us sort of in the same way? They're like trying to see us through the lens as they know it, as a dog, as a cricket, what have you. This might be very difficult to talk about, but I'm curious again, how do animals from your observation see us?
Yeah, I think that it is difficult, and I think one of the most moving things for a lot of people who study animals is getting a sense that they're sort of reaching across that boundary to us. That was one of the most compelling things to read about, in going back to what we were talking about earlier about Jane Goodall's work, that she genuinely felt that she and the chimpanzees that she studied had this bond where it wasn't just all one way. It wasn't just her looking at them and describing their behavior, that they were interacting with her and that they were also seeing her in, the way they did. I think it's harder to do with, different kinds of animals because we just assume that everybody's got the same kinds of sense organs that we have, or everybody's got the same sort of perceptual abilities. And since we don't, even just think about your dog, and how much it relies on odor cues for its life and for the way it gets around. I mean, we must seem bizarre to them because we can't detect this richness in our environment of all the different smells. And there's a lot of dogs in our neighbor. I don't have a dog, but there's a lot of dogs in our neighborhood, and I'm always passing, people walking their dogs, and of course the humans are walking the dog, and the dog is always stopping and trying to sniff, various things along the way. And the humans vary in how patient they are with that, but the dogs always want to smell all the smells, and you just think they if you want to be anthropomorphic about it, then they probably just do not understand why we are ignoring this wealth of information out there, and we aren't even interested. How can we not be interested? And so that's just a really small example of animals that we do communicate with, and we consider, like you started out saying, we consider them animals that we can really relate to pretty well, and yet there's this huge part of their world, their sensory world, that we don't have a clue about.
Sex aside, but obviously, it deals with attraction among animals. From your observations, taking this a step further, like charisma, do you find that to be a behavioral or a physiological trait? Is it genetically, environmentally driven? Because again,
tell me more about what you mean by that. I've never thought about that. That's interesting.
So again, we tend to think of attraction normally in these physical, romantic, in these sexual terms. But attraction is much more than that. It's what attracts us to, say, the leader, the manager of the group, the politician or whatnot, the sports figure. And those that are exuding that charisma. No, do you find any analogies in the animal kingdom? This ability to attract others, much like you have like the so-called alpha males in a primate group or among canines or whatnot. No, what sets the animal up for that?
Huh. I have to confess that A, I've never thought about it, and B, I'm going to fall back on it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
No, in part because I think this idea so you made reference to alpha males, and I think people are very interested in dominance and dominance behavior in animals, and some of that is because of an unfortunate and often inaccurate emphasis on this idea of a hierarchical structure in a lot of animal societies. So a lot of animals, yes, absolutely, there are hierarchies in that there's one animal that can push another animal out of the way if there's food involved or something like that. But in lots of animals, A, they're either not particularly social, or B, the kinds of interactions that they have can't be reduced to a simple, this animal is over that animal who's over that animal, and so on and so forth. And whether you want to call an animal being dominant under one special set of circumstances charismatic or not, I'm not sure I'm ready to go there.
That's fine. And you generated a question for me, and that is also, do you find we tend to overemphasize or become too attentive to the alpha side among animals, and we're really overlooking the importance that betas play. And is it really that simple, alpha and betas? I mean, I'm sure there are much more. There's probably a bunch of sigmas and deltas and omegas at that point. Anyway, in your book, Dancing Cockatoos and the Dead Man Test, you had referenced a 2010 survey in the United States wherein 76% of respondents believed single genes directly control specific human behaviors, and how you found this to be a misconception and that it was troubling in that environmental influence is generally ignored when we know genes don't single-handedly determine anything. And the problems with this is that in extreme cases, misconceptions in these sorts of areas can lead to acceptance of bad or even criminal behavior, such as date rape. You then further drew an analogy from research about people altering their own behavior when exposed to information about how genes play or don't play a role in their lives. Like someone reading an article about, obesity is genetically driven, and the experiment was set up whether they would eat cookies or not, and well, then they would eat more cookies. Whereas if what they were readings talked about obesity being behavioral or environmentally influenced, they tended not to. Would you elaborate on all that?
Sure. I mean, the main message in the Dancing Cockatoos book was about how environmental and genetic roles in behavior are inextricably intertwined. And, this is, of course, the nature-nurture controversy, and people always want to know, well, how much of this is genetic, like we can parse it, like we can carve it out, as though we were, slicing bread or something. And it's, again, we're getting this complicated thing that it's not just that there's a combination of genes in the environment that influence behavior. It's that their interaction is what does it. And that's different than saying they each contribute separately. And the example that I give in the book is of PKU, which is phenylketonuria, which is a disease that, so if anybody's had a baby, or, their partners have had a baby, they take a little blood sample by pricking the heel of newborn babies, and they use that blood sample for testing for a variety of conditions. And one of them is phenylketonuria. And it has to do with, it's a disorder that has to do with the presence of a compound that can break down an amino acid, which is one of the building blocks of protein in the diet. And if you don't have this enzyme, then you can't break down phenylalanine, which is the amino acid, and then phenylalanine builds up, and it has a whole bunch of bad effects in the body, including intellectual disability and some other physiological conditions and so forth. And so babies who have it are very severely affected. However, if you can give those, okay, and the presence of the enzyme, it's determined by the presence of a gene. And so everybody thought, okay, well, so clearly this is a quote unquote genetic disease. There's a gene for it, and so forth. The thing is, if you recognize this, that's why they do the test, and you give those children a diet that lacks phenylalanine, and you have to do some other stuff and so forth, they won't ever develop the condition. So it's actually environmental because it has to do entirely with their diet, one could argue. Well, and of course, that's not true because the diet only matters if they have the gene. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what diet you give them. But the gene only matters depending on the dietary circumstances. And this is not a special example. Pretty much everything is like this, where the effect of the genes occurs in a particular environmental context. The environment only makes the kind of difference it does depending on the genetic context of the individual that you're talking about. And that's true for people, and it's true for animals, it's true for plants for that matter. And so just talking about, to what extent do genes versus the environment contribute is not really a very meaningful question. And I know that people don't like hearing this because they want to know, like, to what extent is aggression genetic? To what extent is sexual orientation genetic? To what extent is intelligence genetic? And you can look at genetic contributions to it. I mean, we're not, scientists are not stupid. Like, we can figure out that it's not like you can train, like if genetics didn't have anything to do with it, you could teach a turtle to talk, but obviously talking has to do with genes that you have for being a human. I mean, we're not stupid. We can figure that much out. But trying to then say, here's one gene that determines what language is in humans is never going to work, because the genes operate in a particular environment, and a particular, environment meaning within an individual. And so, again, sorry, it's complicated.
No, that makes perfect sense.
And I think that people are always grasping at this. And even if you say, oh, it's genes and the environment, then they want to know, but what percentage? It's like everything has to add up to 100%. And so is it 40-60? Is it, 90-10? And again, that's just not a question that's useful to ask.
Well, as maybe sophomoric as it may sound in my description of it, it kind of sounds as if the common human tendency to look for a boogeyman, so to say, to be able to ascribe fault, to always be able to point, to make things black or white. And I guess, and I don't know what influences this. Is it the religions we grow up with, the political ideologies, whatnot? But there's obviously this sort of tendency for us to want to ascribe everything to one simple cause. And basically, what you're telling us, and what I would say most scientists want to try to communicate, and academics, it's more complicated than that. And, you're not going to get that kind of satisfaction. It's just not going to happen. Speaking about the way we see the animal kingdom, the way we see behaviors and whatnot, educate us somewhat about this ubiquitous hierarchical classification of scala natura, the conclusion that it's not just outdated but erroneous. The idea that at the very top of the evolutionary pyramid is the humans, and at the very bottom were the protozoids or whatever, the amoebas that were floating around a long time ago.
Yeah, it's a very, first of all, I think your interpretation that you just made is not at all, I don't know, amateurish or whatever. I think it's just spot on that, we just seem to have this tendency to want to divide things up. It's sort of like that old joke about there's two kinds of people who think there are two kinds of people, and people who don't think there's two kinds of people. Anyway, but yeah, and I think that this, we like dividing things up. Okay, I do think human beings do this all the time because we like making order out of chaos, and we like looking at the world around us and making sense of it. And I like doing that too. So it's not like, this is not a thing I think it's a bad idea. But for many, many, many hundreds of years, actually for thousands of years, humans have had this idea, and I think this does stem originally from religion, that humans are at the pinnacle of what used to be, creation, the pinnacle of all life. In the original version of the Scala Naturae, it was that human beings were closest to the image of God, and then that there were angels and various other things, and then all the other creatures could be arrayed kind of below humans, depending on their similarity to people, and hence presumably to higher spiritual beings. And so you see a lot of references to the so-called evolutionary scale or the evolutionary ladder, and there's tons and tons of depictions of this. For a while I used to collect cartoons that showed it was a shoreline, and there was a fish in the water, and then crawling out of the water was sort of a four-legged amphibian, and then there'd be a reptile, and then like some kind of mammal. They always skip birds in those things, I don't know. Some kind of mammal, and then the mammals eventually, there's monkeys, and then the monkeys are standing on two legs, and then eventually you end up with a person, and it's always a guy holding a spear, and it's always a guy, and it's always he's always holding a spear. I don't know what the deal is with that. And then often in the more modern renditions, there's sort of this implication that we've all, gone terribly wrong because the last image is of the same guy that was holding the spear in the previous image, but now he's, hunched over a computer with, terrible posture and looking like really worried, or else he's, he's got a fast food bag and he's kind of paunchy and he's, eating a burger or, something like that. And so, the implication, and this is one of the famous captions, is that somewhere something went terribly wrong. So I think that image that, oh, well, we evolved from fish and so we're better than fish, and amphibians are better than fish, but mammals are better than amphibians, and so on and so forth. That got really ingrained in us, and there have been some interesting, things on the history of this idea, and like I said, it does have religious roots. But the problem with it is that it's just a misconception of the way that evolution actually works. In that, yes, it is true that we have ancestors, evolutionarily speaking, that looked like fish. But our ancestors are not like the goldfish that you would have swimming around in your goldfish bowl. Our ancestors are not, even though people talk about sharks as being evolutionary, fossil, living fossils or what have you, our ancestors are not the kinds of sharks that we see swimming around today. Because all organisms evolved from common ancestors, sure, but then those ancestors branched off, and the better way to think of it is not as a ladder but as a bush. And so if time is going from the bottom to the top of the bush has all these different branches, and some of the branches didn't go anywhere, and those are lines that went extinct. Some of them branched off a lot, and at the tips of the branches are all the things that are alive today. But there's definitely a tip of a branch that's still related to those fish and is still more similar to that common ancestor. We're not more evolved than fish. We're just as evolved as fish. It's just our ancestor with fish looked more like fish. I don't know what you want to do with that, but okay. And I think that this idea that you can rank all these animals, and people used to do this a lot. I'm interested in how people think about animal intelligence too, and they used to do this a lot where, oh gosh, if you just Google 10 smartest animals, there will be no shortage of people with very strong opinions on what number 9 is, what number 8, so 10 of course is people, what number 9 is, what number 8 is, do we put raccoons at number 4, because they have little hands, but then octopus now, people are like, oh, all about octopus, but then you think, well, I don't know what octopus do that, other animals don't do, I don't know, they're just having a little moment here. And so the whole thing is it's incredibly subjective, and also has no basis in the way evolution actually works. And the whole living fossil thing is just odd because sure, there are animals that look more or less like their ancestors at more or less a distant time. Again, what do you want to do with this? Crocodiles look a lot like ancient crocodiles. It doesn't mean that they're not good at being crocodiles. It doesn't mean that it's it just doesn't mean anything. It just means they look more like their ancestors. Where are you going with this? I always get puzzled at people who really want to push the whole thing, especially like I said about the smart thing, and they want to give these increasingly complicated tests to animals, and it's just.
Well, for additional context, for the benefit of the audience, it's you had pointed out in your book that as an example that, well, we're not necessarily the culmination of evolution because dogs actually evolved way after humans. And you then also went into a description of many other animals, and that, well, if technically we're the culmination, well, nothing should have evolved after us. And that's obviously not the case. And I think it really kind of turns things around. And to me, I also find it's an interesting sort of critique of even your own scientific community, that perhaps the whole way we look at evolution needs to be perhaps reassessed.
Well, now wait a minute. Who do you mean? Who do you mean by we? I feel like the way we scientists look at evolution does not need to be reassessed. It's the way it's not popularized.
Exactly.
Any biologist will tell you about the tree of life with all of its branches, and that, this does not lead to things being, higher, or we don't talk about there being, higher and lower forms of life. So I take a little bit of exception to that. And I will add to the business of, recency of things evolving, that the best example, of course, is how of things that recently evolved is disease organisms. COVID-19 virus evolved super fast, right? Is it like more evolved and more at the pinnacle of evolution than people? I presume not. And even if you don't want to use viruses because they do, they are a special case, they need to live in other living cells. There's plenty of bacteria that are free living that evolved extremely recently. This is why we have trouble with antibiotic resistant bacteria, is that the bacteria evolved to be substantially different than they used to be. So I don't know, higher form of life? I don't think so.
Um, would you say that the tree, the image of the tree, is a proper image to use?
Yeah,
Uh,
we talk about the tree of life all the time. Yeah, sure.
okay.
Although the images are extremely complicated, and if you Google tree of life and want an image of it, you'll often get what looks like a sort of spiral where there's lots of little branches. So it's not so much a tree. There is a root, but there's like a spiral coming off of it with hundreds, if not thousands, of little branches, and it's difficult to depict. But yeah, I mean that is kind of a better heuristic than
I
the
was
last.
I was just curious if perhaps like a bunch of bushes, not one bush, but a bunch of bushes might actually be a even more accurate example of evolution.
Well, but the reason we use the tree is that of course we want to emphasize that all life came from a single ancestor, like all life came from a single ancestor, which is kind of mind blowing when you think about it. So
Yes. Speaking of evolution, speak to us a bit about emotional evolution. You raised the question if it's reasonable for other animals to have vastly different reproductive respiratory systems than people, why should we think they have the same emotions we do? And then I wanted to use the example of there's been research about how not only a crow has a capacity to hold a grudge, it can also pass it laterally to its cohorts and generationally to its offspring. What are your thoughts about this?
yeah, so the business about having different emotions than us is I was trying to push back against this kind of funny notion that I think a lot of people, including some biologists, have, which is that and again, they're often looking just at primates or maybe at like big social carnivores or something, and they want to talk about them having emotions, and they say, oh, the rest of you scientists, you're just being heartless, and you're being too pedantic, and you think that no other animal can have human emotions, but I'm positive that these the late Franz de Waal was a big proponent of this, that he felt like other non-human primates had real human emotions like jealousy and love and grief and so forth. And like, it's not that I don't think animals can't have something that we would call emotions, but I don't understand the push to make it seem exactly like human emotions. So in other words, we don't get worried about the fact that a chimpanzee's liver functions differently than ours does. And we don't even get worried about the fact that their brain has different structures than ours does. So assuming that emotions are a result of our bodies and our physiology and our brains, why would we think that their emotions would be exactly the same? I think you tend to fall into this sort of almost supernatural belief about where, about mind body dualism, and where our feelings come from and so forth. And so it seems perfectly reasonable to me to think that animals will be mentally perhaps more like people than we would have given credit. Like I'm fine with that, but why would we think that their emotions would be exactly like ours when their physiology and anatomy isn't?
Hmm.
Where else are those emotions going to come from?
Oh, you're asking the wrong person at that point. I know you're asking rhetorically.
Yeah,
um,
but do you see what I mean there? That it is kind of funny, and it's one of the reasons why I'm fascinated by people being so insistent that their dog absolutely recognized, had exactly the same reaction to the death of another dog than that they would have to it, because they don't know, and that's okay, and that's not denigrating dogs at all.
no, no. And obviously, animals. for lack of a better word, experience loss in their social community, whether it's, another dog, or it's, the human master, so to say, or like we see in elephants. So obviously they experience the absence of this other member of the group. But I think you're raising a valid point. Is it this? Are they experiencing it the way we are? Sadness, and again, that's a very difficult proposition to undertake. We're not saying no. We're not saying yes. Is what I'm gathering here. It's just this tendency to again impose human characteristics onto animals.
And what that leads us to, I think, is creating these weird divisions. It's almost like we want to make a club of animals that are more like us and animals that we're not going to have in the club. And we've done this for a long time with, and we often use intelligence. And so, well, we think that, non-human primates are really intelligent. So we've got chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas or whatever I say, it's like we're making this big basket, and we're in the basket and they're in the basket, and dolphins, everybody's really, oh yes, dolphins are almost like people because they can do all this complex stuff. Although I do have a friend who works on dolphins, and he says they're just like cows. It's just they're oceanic. But in their behavior, we can come back to that if you want. But anyway, so there's dolphins in the basket. People are into crows. Like you said, crows are, have become very popular, and they're crows and jays and their relatives. They're now in the basket. Octopus are having kind of a moment, so they're in the basket. And you're like, where are you going with this? You can find animals that are more or less like what we recognize in people, and then you will have made a list of animals that are more or less like people, and you're trying to say that they're more or less like people. I just don't see the point. And what it does is it does give you this very, I think, categorical thinking that has you missing out on the scope of what a lot of animals can really do. So a lot of insects or and spiders, for instance, with brains that are like barely visible, some of them not even visible, can perform incredibly complicated behaviors. And so you don't need, as I am fond of saying, you do not need a big brain to do big things. So where are you going with the basket? Like, why do you want to put some things in the basket and leave other things out?
Well, I mean, I think we even make these mistakes among humans, the tendency to project, right, our own values on others, right?
Of course,
Uh,
yeah.
so,
Well, and I mean, you're free to decide that there are people you want to be friends. Like I'm not saying you
yeah.
have to equivalently and uncritically accept everybody and everything. Like it's fine to have opinions about people. I have lots of them. I'm sure you do too. But that's different than, like I said, setting up this kind of species hierarchy of things that are like us and things that are not like us, and then feeling like we've somehow gotten somewhere.
Um, Deviating momentarily, I'm sure you're familiar with that study of where they took photographs of individuals and sort of different states of emotion, representative of different cultures in the world, to demonstrate that there are sort of commonalities and expressions of anger and happiness. What are your thoughts on that?
So that's a very old, that kind of study. Like Darwin was really interested. He wrote a whole book called The Expression of the Emotion in Man and Animals, or I think I can't. That may not be the exact title, but it's close enough. And so he was very interested in that. And he used to at dinner parties like show people, pictures of people from different parts of the world with different, emotions, and have people guess. My understanding, and I'm not an expert in this, and I could Google it quickly, but I'm not going to bother while we're talking. My understanding is that there's been some questioning of the universality of this, that, for a long time it was that, oh yes, fear looks like fear, anger looks like anger. And then there's been some discussion of, is that really true? Is it not? And, again, I don't have any, reason to think either way, but, it wouldn't surprise me. Again, living things are similar to each other. Sure. Why wouldn't we show different, why wouldn't we show similarities in the way we respond to different kinds of stimuli? How good we are at detecting stuff with other, in other people. I mean, we're going to be better at it with other people than we are with other animals. But again, to go back to my don't need a big brain to do big things, bees actually can learn to recognize individual human faces. so they can tell differences among individual people. And so, okay, like, does that, again, where are you going with this? Probably they can do it because there's been selection, natural selection has produced bees that are really good at discriminating small visual differences. And they do this because they do it with flowers, because they go out and pollinate flowers. And so being able to recognize which flowers, say, have greater nectar rewards is going to be good for them.
Huh.
So the same skill can transfer to telling an individual person with wider set eyes from one with narrower set eyes. Okay. Again, where are you going with this? It is interesting looking at other animals without thinking about in ways that they have to be like people.
Maybe it's just part of the human desire to want to connect, to be
Yeah,
able to relate.
absolutely. And so, because you go from that and you think, oh, that's really adorable. So, like the bees in my garden can learn to recognize me and that I'm different from, somebody else who comes into the garden. I mean, that is kind of cute, but,
Well, they might prove to be the biological tool and facial recognition and the ultimate form of surveillance.
Oh God, I probably think AI is going to be a bit. I seldom invoke AI as a solution to our problems, but I think in this case you'd be better off with AI than you would be with bees.
Shifting gears and speaking of brains, is bigger better? Is brain size a reliable measure of intelligence or of anything else for that matter? And does domestication make you dumb?
So people used to talk, again, this is a very old idea. People have been interested in brain size and its relationship to intelligence for ages. And the short answer is, not really. I mean, obviously, if you can make all else equal, then not so much overall brain size, but the size of certain brain components, if you're looking within a certain group, can be related to the ability to problem solve. If that floats your boat, that's fine. But you can't, again, have this gigantic ranking of animals with bigger brains and animals with smaller brains and say that the bigger ones are always going to be smarter than the smaller ones. Even correcting for body size is a kind of shaky way to do it because, again, it depends on the body components. My friend who worked on the dolphins and said they were like cows pointed out that, yes, they do have enormous brains for their body size, relative to their body size, depending on how you measure it, that some cetaceans actually have larger brains for their body size than people do. But remember what cetaceans are doing with their brains. They're using them for echolocating, and that requires a lot, where they're bouncing sound off of the objects in the environment and interpreting the echoes that come back to sense what's out there. That requires a lot of wetware, as it were, in the brain. So, okay, they need a lot of that to do echolocation. Does echolocation mean you're smart? I mean, if I was a dolphin, I would think if you couldn't echolocate, you were hopelessly stupid. But that's just because dolphins do that.
But then bats have smaller brains than dolphins and they do echolocation.
They do echolocate. And so, but they have, and so that's what I mean about a brain component. So,
yes.
So yeah, a lot of it falls apart. People have definitely looked within, say, birds and looked at the size of different parts of the brain, not just the brain as a whole. And there is a connection between the size of different parts of the brain and, for instance, aspects of their social behavior or aspects of their foraging behavior or something like that. Okay. I mean, I'm not saying it's not interesting. I'm just saying that this sort of weird goal of, and now we need to rank them according to people is the part that's perplexing to me.
Speaking of echolocation and taking a certain fantastical perspective to this, is it physiologically possible for the human brain to have echolocation ability?
I think that one's above my pay grade. I mean, certainly you can, in a very sort of low level sense, all sound is perception of sound waves bouncing back at us. And so theoretically, there's no reason that we couldn't get better at it, at interpreting sounds bouncing back at us to figure out where things are. I mean, we already do this to some extent. Like you can tell if you're in a crowd, you can tell if you're in an empty room or a crowded room if you're talking.
Yes.
You can tell, and some of that is because a crowded room reflects sound waves back at you differently. That's a far cry from what bats or dolphins can do, though.
Yes. Speaking of brains and what we can do with them, there are documented instances of animals playing, problem solving. Um, do animals have intentional artistic abilities, or better stated, are animals able to are they able to be intentionally creative?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, we've all seen the things of, here's a painting that the monkey did, and here's the didn't some elephant paint something and
Yes, I think so. And some horse was able to do math, I think, or something.
yeah. The intentionality is a really tricky one, though, because, again, how do we even know whether you can get a lot of psychologists who would argue that you don't really know what you were intending to do. You just think you knew what you were intending to do. So I think it does get kind of complicated, and that's part of why um, scientists tend to be quite careful about talking about this.
Yes.
We do talk about motivation sometimes, but it's always defined operationally, so that you say, oh, an animal that engages in an activity more readily would have a higher motivation. But I'm kind of, okay, so what you've just said is that what you've described is how ready it is to engage in that behavior. How does that differ from, like, we know what motivation is because we can feel motivated, but it's really hard to tell it in another animal. And it's sort of the same thing. Getting back to an earlier thing you were asking about, it's sort of the same thing as talking about instinct. That I'm very leery of using that word because it's kind of like saying that you understood something, but it's just giving it another name. So you say, oh, we have a food seeking instinct, or, a hunger instinct or whatever. What does that mean? It means we seek out food when we haven't had enough food. And you can look at the neurological basis of that, which has been done and which is very interesting. And, like, how does an animal decide, quote unquote, when it's had enough to eat? Where does satiety come from? But that's operationally defining it, saying that there was a column in our newspaper that was, somebody said, well, how do birds know how to build the kind of nest that they build? Because, each kind of bird builds a different sort of nest. And the answer was kind of, well, they have an instinct that tells them how. And it's like, that's a non-answer to me. It's like, well, it builds the kind of nest it does because it builds the kind of nest it does. It has an instinct to build that nest. That's not telling me anything.
Hmm. Um, when it comes to building, making decisions or whatnot, um, I had wanted to ask you, you know, how do animals make decisions? But again, reflecting on the question, again, I'm kind of worried about, are we again projecting human characteristics onto animals? But do you find animals engage in a process of decision making?
Oh yeah, animals make decisions all the time. I mean, to sit that you can operationalize, that you can say,
Okay.
okay, I give an animal two choices and it makes one, and so it's sure it makes decisions all the time.
Do you again, at risk of sounding very juvenile in the question, but how much of a difference is there actually between the way we as humans make decisions and animals? Um,
No,
unknown. She.
no. I mean, it depends what you mean by the way. See, this is the scientist's answer always. It depends what you mean by how we make decisions and how they make decisions. Are there, neurological pathways that lead to different parts of the brain being activated that lead to different neurons? Yes, of course. Is that what happens in animals? Yes, of course. Um,
Okay. Well, with that in mind, and again, some of the talks I've had with others, and even before then, you find a lot of literature out there when it comes to leadership or how you inspire your organization. And this concept of decision making being based on the alleged primordial drive to engage in flight, fight, or freeze in response to a perceived threat that people in an organization sometimes don't want to do what the leaders are guiding them towards because it's a threat, meaning it's a change in their environment. And we are instinctually, we're genetically driven to, treat threats as a danger. But, do you find this to be true that we, you know, we act out of our reptilian brain, so to say?
One of my favorite papers that I read for the Dancing Cockatoos book has the fabulous title of Your Brain is Not an Onion with a Tiny Lizard Inside. And I thought it was just the best title ever. I actually emailed the author because I just thought it was a fabulous title. So the paper was arguing against this idea that, we have a lizard brain and then there's kind of layers on top of it that have become modified, and that the primordial brain is, has these very primitive responses and so forth. And what they point out is that, first of all, there is no such thing that you could call really our lizard brain. And besides, why is everybody denigrating lizards? Lizards function perfectly well, and you don't see them flying into rages, do you? You really don't. And so I don't really quite get where that's coming from. And lizards don't have any more whatever behavior than anything else. Lizards function just fine doing lizard things. But anyway, the idea that let me backtrack. Sure, there are absolutely responses that, in a sense, can bypass, more complicated neurological pathways. Whether that and there is, like, you can physiologically characterize, as you say, a fight or flight response, but that's been, that's a generalized term for a whole basket of physiological, hormonal and, other kinds of physical responses. I don't know. I'm always leery of this, here's one simple trick that can show you how to respond under pressure, or a good leader will always do this one thing that will harness the whatever of their, followers and so forth. Because I feel like it's often this very, very exaggerated view of something that doesn't really work in practice.
Do you find, and this at this point is not a projection of a human characteristic on animals, but just like, we've seen among people that we'll behave completely differently as a group than we will as individuals. Do you see the same thing in the animal kingdom?
Sure. I mean, people go so far as to point out that in social insects, there's a very prominent theory that says that you have what's called a superorganism. I'm putting that in quotes, which is that the hive or the colony acts as though it's itself an organism that's composed of many the individual bees or ants or whatever that are in it. So obviously they act differently in a group than they do as individuals. I mean, in the social insects are to the point where they can't really exist by themselves anyway, but that's probably the most extreme example.
What do you think we can learn from animal behaviors, regardless of species activity, that would actually make us better decision makers or to effectively act as a collective?
I don't know what I mean, I could give a sort of a simple answer, which is that so one thing is that animals do not always, contrary to popular belief, that animals do not always do things that are in the moment beneficial for their own well-being, that there are plenty of examples of animals that do things that will benefit a group, generally not at the expense of their eventual well-being, i.e. sometimes being part of a colony or part of a social group is by and large beneficial. So there's that. But I think it's really hard, again, to come up with these more simple, animals know that if you, do something nice for somebody that they will do something nice for you, which I don't know, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So I think that kind of generalization is kind of hard to come by. I think what animals can tell us is that there isn't one kind of animal response to things, because often people feel like they've risen above, we don't act like animals because we make rational decisions, or we don't act like animals because we, have somehow overcome our baser natures. And I don't think there's this just like I don't think there's this separation between genes and the environment. I don't think there's this separation between baser nature and another kind of nature. I mean, sure, people are different from other kinds of animals, but other kinds of animals are different from each other too. And so I I think it's not really helpful to say, oh, well, what can I do that I can apply biologically to the way I'm going to behave that's going to be different than the way I would behave in some other way.
Tell us a bit about your upcoming book.
Sure. So I have a book that's coming out in March of 2026 that's called Outsider Animals, and it's about those species that we encounter in our lives, and not necessarily because we want to, but we do anyway. And sometimes we think of them as pests, sometimes they don't. I think in almost all, so it's things like gulls and raccoons and cockroaches and rats. Cowbirds are another example of those animals where we run into them. We have lots of opinions about them, and in almost every case, we sell them short, and they're much more interesting than we've given them credit for. So I've got chapters on lots of different ones. I had a great time writing it. I got to talk to a lot of interesting people. Like I said, that one's going to be out in March.
Well, tell us a little bit about some of those animals that we underestimate, especially the cockroaches. I ask, having grown up in New Orleans, and cockroaches are a fundamental part of life down there. Tell us about what we could learn from them.
It's not so much. Well, so I developed. So I always joke with people that the cockroach chapter was my favorite chapter. But so cockroaches are super interesting from an evolutionary perspective, but also cockroaches are way more diverse than people think by just having had them in their kitchens or their yards or whatever. Even in a semi-tropical place like New Orleans, because I always, there's like thousands and thousands of species of cockroaches. Lots of them live blameless lives, far from humans. They have no, there's only a small handful that are pests. A lot of them are really beautiful. They look like little jewels. They're, gorgeously colored. And some of them are monogamous, and they raise their babies together in little family groups. So there's a mommy cockroach and a daddy cockroach and little baby cockroaches, which is really adorable. And also, and so I always tell people that they're so diverse that it would be kind of like saying that if you'd seen a chicken, that it's like, oh yeah, I know everything about birds, right? Which is not true. Which is not true. So I think that people sell cockroaches short. And also, because some cockroaches give birth to live young, they've been actually instrumental in helping us understand some things about the evolution of pregnancy, which I think is a good place to end on, because I don't want to give everything away here after all.
Okay. As we come towards an end here, what, if any, misconceptions would you like to address that people have of your particular field? Or, in the alternative, what would you like people to be more aware of when it comes to evolutionary biology, behavioral ecology?
That nature has lots of different solutions to the same problem. So all we're all doing here on Earth, all living things, is stuff that perpetuates our genes into future generations. That's it. That's the whole point, if you want to consider that a point or not. But there's so many different ways to do this that people trying to come up with, oh, this is the natural way, this is the best way, this is the way that organisms should do things, it's destined to fail, because there is this incredible diversity of I talk about animals because I work on animals, of what animals do. And so trying to say, oh, we should be more like the bonobos, or we should be less like the bonobos, or we should be more like, I don't know, swans that mate for life, or we should be more like, I don't know, some kind of rodent that mates many times, is just destined to fail.
Well, thank you, Dr. Zuk, for outlining the field of evolutionary biology, delving into these nuances of animal behaviors and how the study of same can benefit us. Thank you to the audience for listening. Thank you to the University of Minnesota. As your host, Maurice Brungart, I welcome you to join us next week, and that you invite others to follow Brungart Law's Lagniappe, where we provide a little extra perspective, because the devil is always in the details. Dr. Zuk, again, gratitude.
Thanks so much. This is really fun.